Welcome to your very last session of Summer Institute. You have made it through 2 huge days of really great sessions. I know that I have learned a lot, and I know that I'm super honored that at the end of the day, after all this learning, you're deciding to spend the next 45 minutes with us. Our goal is that we are going to hopefully be relaxed and have a good time. Tim and I are not formal or fancy, despite his fancy shirt. We want to encourage you to use the chat and get engaged because that will make this much more fun. Our learning targets today are to explore the role and value of Wikipedia as an information source. And so that might be something that you're really curious about. We're going to talk a little bit about how we can use that standards-based lens, which we are all obviously really invested in as we're looking at evaluating and citing information. And then we're going to actually use some tools and some resources to explore how this might look in our context. So some information about us. My name is Amber Delliger. My pronouns are she, her. I teach for Metro North Adult Basic Education. I am housed at Anoka Ramsey Community College, where I teach developmental math, and I am also a student success coach. I am also on the Atlas A team for the math PD, and I just can't talk. This is my 4th session that I've presented today. I am the Adult Numeracy Network Region 3 representative. I am really excited to introduce you all to my friend Tim, and I'll let him introduce himself in a second. Tim and I got to know each other due to pandemic. He is my neighbor, and he became forced into my pandemic pod, and we had lots and lots of conversations on our daily walks. So this is a picture of us in the middle of the winter on one of our 5-mile walks in the morning. So Tim, please introduce yourself.
Hi. Thanks for having me here. I am not involved in ABE at all, but I am a librarian. I'm the library director and an associate professor at United Theological Seminary. And as Amber and I took our long walks and had lots of time to fill, we talked a lot about how librarians do their work. And it was interesting to see all the different overlap that we had in the way in which we do our jobs. And it was just like boom, 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 all these different pieces of overlap. And as we were talking, Amber said, we need to present on this. And I said, okay, sure. And so that this is kind of the result of a lot of 5-mile walks in the snow.
Go back, we're not ready, Tim.
Aren't we? Okay, all right.
One of the things we want to know is we are going to launch a poll here. I am really curious of how you use Wikipedia. So Linz, can you there we go. You will see this warm-up poll on your screen here. There's just 2 questions. One question is, I use Wikipedia as a resource in my everyday life. Often, sometimes, rarely, or never. And question number 2, I have used Wikipedia as an academic resource with my students. Love that we are all jumping into this poll right away. Already almost 75%, great job. We'll give you just another second. Here. So let's look at what we have found out. Oh, my internet's going to do the internet thing again. That's great. So one of the things that we're seeing here is that everybody has at least used Wikipedia as a resource. I was just recently on vacation to Yellowstone with my wife and kids, and we were Wikipedia-ing. James, I'm sorry, that's probably a horrible thing to translate and to interpret. Wikipedia, we were looking up things, animals and things we saw all the time. And then looking down here, a third of us have never used Wikipedia with students, and we're going to really look at what might that be, what might cause that, and why we might see that. And then hopefully by the end of our session today, maybe for those of us that rarely or never use it, might consider using it. All right, so go ahead, Tip.
All right. So let's talk about why Wikipedia has a bad reputation. So as a librarian who's been a librarian for many years now, um, we often hear this sort of complaint, I suppose you could say, from students who like to use Wikipedia and from the instructors who don't like that the students are using Wikipedia. And we get this sort of in-between place as librarians where we want to try to help the students accomplish their goals. And we also want to honor the requests of the instructors. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about how Wikipedia is used. I'm one of those people that uses Wikipedia every single day for something or the other. And so it's been interesting to me to hear students who use it and feel frustrated about their inability to use it. But why is that? Why does Wikipedia have such a bad reputation? So we're just going to do a very quick historical look at Wikipedia. So Wikipedia was launched in 2001, so 2 decades ago now. It is currently the largest and most read reference work in history. And so in terms of thinking about all the different encyclopedias and dictionaries and all those different kinds of tools, Wikipedia is number one. It has consistently, over the last 2 decades, been one of the top 15 access websites in the world. So that's not just here in the United States, that's across the globe. And when you think about the fact that although now there are growing Wikipedia sites in other languages, primarily it's still in English. And so that's pretty significant. One of the things that's really important to understand about Wikipedia is that it is a nonprofit organization that refuses advertising dollars. So in terms of those websites we're talking about, the 15 most accessed websites, it's one of the few that has no advertising in it. And that's really important when we think about the value of that information. It is not being skewed by dollars paid by companies to make themselves look good. It's collaborative with thousands of contributors, and we're going to talk more about that in just a second. So early on, the information was really uneven. So you had some really good articles, some good pages that had lots of really important, helpful information. And then you had pages that were very unreliable with false information. And some of you may have heard about in the past where people have made Wikipedia pages that were false, that they had purposely put bad information in them, and then they tracked that information and saw how bad false information was being used. And so that became a real problem. And early on, there was a very small number of collaborators. So in terms of expertise, in terms of the ability to get things corrected, there was a smaller group of people working on it. Today, that's not the case. So 20 years later, it's very, very different. Today, the idea that anyone can make a change to an article is simply not true. Most of the articles are locked down, and only contributors that have been vetted are allowed to update those articles. This is really important, especially in the more, what we might say, controversial topics. So things like politics, articles about particular people or historical events. Not just anyone can go in and change those articles. And it is often upheld, especially in the library world, as one of the best examples of what we like to talk about as the democratization of knowledge. And what we mean by that is that it's knowledge that is made available to everyone, and it is also, again, in theory, everyone has the right to weigh in. So the article on a particular political figure, for example, isn't written by somebody who really likes that person, but instead is allowed to be democratized through the particular vetting process that takes. And so while it started out as maybe not a great source, currently Wikipedia is probably one of the most equal sources of information when we're talking about reference materials that's available to us and to our students.
Tim, there's some questions in the chat about vetting. Do you have any information about who's the vetters?
The community vets themselves. And so the way that it works is that when somebody wants to make a change or a contribution to a particular article that's pre-existing, they will post that, and the rest of the community will decide whether they feel like that is a valid change. So there's a conversation that takes place. And then if it's agreed upon that that change should be made, then the person who proposed the change is allowed to make the change themselves. And so at that point, then they're allowed to become a contributor. So it's a community that vets it, and it's the community that decides as a whole. And so that it can get a little dicey at times. People sometimes will feel that it's not fair, but generally speaking, again, because it's that idea that everyone who has a valid point or a way of presenting, they should be allowed to contribute. It tends to be a very fair process.
So I see some great questions about the community. So you keep saying like the community. Is there like a process that allows you to become a person who can look at this? Or is there like, so is there like super users, or how does that work?
Yes, yeah, so there are super users, but again, everyone is equal. So if you want to make a change to an article, you do have to set up an account. You have to sign up and set up your account so that they again get some sort of personal information. It's not a lot of information. And then again, it's based on your proposed contribution. So it's about what you're proposing. It's not your particular credentials. So they're not looking at your credentials and saying, oh, you're an expert in this field, therefore your voice is more valid. It's more about what are you trying to add to this particular article, and does that information add value? Is it correct? Does it make sense to add it or not? So you will actually see, if you spend a lot of time in Wikipedia, where there will be notes at the top of a page where it will say there is a discussion going on about a particular issue. Be aware that not everyone is happy, but there's a discussion going on. So even for you or I, if we're just a casual user, we can actually see those discussions if you like. You just have to click on that link then, and you can see the conversation. So it lets you even be involved in seeing what that conversation is, even if you choose not to be involved.
And one of the changes that has occurred is a lot of it is much more providing evidence and ways to support your claim. It's not just, I think this person wrestled a bear. You have to have evidence to put that in.
Correct. Yeah. And so it's just like if you were writing a research paper, we're looking for footnotes, essentially. And we're going to talk more about that in just a bit. All right. Should we go on?
Yeah. So Tim, why should students start using Wikipedia? Why is it a good place for our students to start?
So I'm going to read this quote really quickly. This is from what librarians, academic librarians, this is kind of our mandate, if you will. It's our professional mandate. And it says that students have a greater role and responsibility in creating new knowledge, in understanding the contours and changing dynamics of the world of information, and in using information, data, and scholarship ethically. So what this is saying in not fancy words is that essentially gone are the days when the student just is the receptor of information and knowledge. But now we are asking students to become the creators of that knowledge. And that's that, again, that idea of democratization of knowledge. It's not the instructor who owns all the information and shares it. We're asking the students to become part of that contribution and part of that process. And so for you all as instructors in the areas where you work, we want to talk just briefly, and Amber's going to talk a little bit about how this kind of overlaps, these ideas overlap with some of the benchmarks that you as instructors are working for with your students.
So I put in the chat to try to prime you to think about these expectations. If you are familiar with our Common Core standards, especially a lot of those ELA anchors, a lot of thinking critically and evaluating sources and communicating your understandings come through very heavily in both the reading, the writing, and the speaking. There, it just comes out everywhere. And additionally, in our math standards, when we have to critique the reasoning of others and we have to do these skills, it comes up everywhere. You'll also see it in our North Star standards and in our ACES TIF. This idea of being a critical receiver of information is one of the most important skill sets our students need to leave us with. And so when we look at Wikipedia, or any resources that we're using for our students, we want to think, how are they going to be the receiver of that information? How are they going to digest that information? And then how are they going to utilize that information in a way that is meaningful and purposeful, but also still honors the intention of that text? So Wikipedia as a starting point is really helpful, one, because our students are often familiar with it in informal ways. And there's a lot of power to be had about something that you can have as an empowerment area. Our students feel comfortable with using a Wikipedia page as a resource for themselves, but thinking about how can you use those skills, because that skill is really transferable in other areas of our critical thinking. So in a Wikipedia page, which we're going to look at here shortly, we're going to look at how it models a really nice outline, which is a huge skill for our students as we're getting into those D and E level CCRS skills. It also provides how to learn more. There's a lot of areas that you can click and explore and see how this information is connected in ways that we might not normally be able to see, in a way that's really easy to access. So there's not a lot of barriers to, how does this relate to that, and being able to research. It also helps our students have really easy access to experts. So we're going to show you on how to leverage the fact that there are sources for all the Wikipedia articles that our students are going to be accessing, and how to see how this comes together. So not only is it providing a good model, but it's an interactive model. So it's not a static document. We're able to interact with it, which then helps inform our thinking. Our thinking isn't static either. So it's much more intuitive in that way. Finally, as we're working on trying to get some really good writing samples out of our students, one of our biggest challenges is this idea of researching in both primary and secondary sources. And our students often have a hard time delineating those two, or understanding how we use those two differently in supporting our reasoning. And so Wikipedia is going to give us a really good model, if we structure it right, on how we consume and share information. So we want you to play. It is 3:20 on Thursday afternoon. And so we're going to give you a challenge. We are going to do something called a Wiki Race. It's similar if you've done a web quest, but very different. It's nothing at all like that, is it, Tim? We're going to give you a challenge, and we are only going to give you a few minutes to do this. So you may not be able to finish. Don't worry. However, there's a risk in doing this. So I'm going to put my colleague to colleague hat on and not my teacher hat. I'm going to ask you to go to a different website, but I'm also going to ask you to come back. So make sure that as we do this, that you do come back, because we got more stuff to do. So on our Wiki Race, I want to challenge you to see if you can start at Genghis Khan, and just by clicking things on a wiki page, can you get to Nintendo Switch? For those of you who are doing this, I want you to think about how many clicks did it take you to get from one to the other? And what was your pathway? Where did you go on the way? So kind of that, for my older friends here, that 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon. How many degrees of Kevin Bacon are there between Genghis Khan and Nintendo Switch? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the link to start out with in the chat. And I want you to click on that. If you are watching this as a recording, pause your video, go check it out. We're going to go to the Genghis Khan wiki page. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to see how far you can get. We're going to have a poll running. When you get back, answer the poll. So we're going to be quiet. Go have fun. If you are struggling, you can chat into Cindy or Lindsay and they can give you a hand. So I'm going to be quiet. Go click and count your clicks. All right, friends, I want you to spend about 10 more minutes, or not 10 more minutes, 10 more seconds. All right, even if you are not done, if you can hear my voice, please come back, join us, and answer this poll so that I know you're back. It's okay if you didn't finish, just mark it down, but if you answer the poll, then I know you are back and ready to participate with us here. We're doing great. At least half of you are back. Let's see if we can get some more. Come back. We miss you. The poll should be on your screen. It might have gotten hidden when you switched your tabs, and that's cool. I can see your back, Joanne. Come back. Thanks. If you look at the bottom, there might be a poll there. If not, it's cool. This is just a way for us to make sure you're back. Let's do about another 10 seconds. And then Lindsay, you can go ahead and share the poll here. This is just a way for us to get back together. So for those of you that would try to do something like this in your virtual classroom, having a task that a student has to do when they get back is a good way for you to know that right now we have 11 participants that are out doing something else, or we're able to pull people back. But thank you for coming back and thank you for trying that. So I'm just looking at, we got a lot of people that didn't get to finish because they were playing with their stuff. We had some people who were really, really efficient. They got through in 1 to 5 clicks. I would love to see if anybody got there in 1. And then some people took a long time, and there's not just one right path, which is great when we talk to our math students about how there's not always one like strict pathway to get to a solution. So Tim, we looked at Wiki. We saw one. We looked at a couple. Now, how do I use this thing you're calling a reference interview?
Yeah, so the reason why a Wiki Race is a really useful tool for teaching about information. And that's what librarians do all the time. We talk about information and how do we teach people how to use information, is that as librarians, we use what's called a reference interview. A reference interview is what happens when any of you go to the reference desk and ask a librarian for help. And what you may not know is that we as librarians practice that a lot. And it's not something that comes naturally at times for us, but we practice how do we help people the most. And so I want to just really quickly go through what we do, because as we think about how to help our students, using the technique of a reference interview can be really helpful in helping our students as they're thinking about how they need to do and accomplish the task, especially when we're talking about literacy and information. So obviously we start with something like a welcome. That's pretty obvious. And we talk about how librarians have these very bad stereotypes. So we're supposed to smile and pretend, like we're really interested. And we always are, of course. And then we ask what they need. And this is always interesting because you never quite know what you're going to get asked because it's a reference desk. And I've been asked everything from, I need to find that red book I used last week, to some very strange questions about medical issues. I'm suffering from this condition, help me figure it out, all kinds of different things. And so you listen, and it's really important as we're interacting with students to listen, to hear what they're saying, because the next step is the most important. And it's the hardest as well. It's actually figuring out what the question is. Now, I'm not sure who did the research in terms of how they figured it out, but the standard assumption among librarians is that about 70% of the time, the person asking the question is asking the wrong question for the information that they need. So for example, they may need legal help when they're researching something because they're in legal trouble. And they will ask all kinds of questions about the situation without actually telling the librarian, I need legal help. This can be very, very important when we're dealing with things like immigration, for example, because a person will come into the library, ask some questions. English might be a second language for them. They're concerned about something that's real, that's important to them, that could be a life and death situation, and they're not asking the right questions because the questions they're asking won't get them the information they need. And so what we need to do as librarians, but you also as instructors and educators, we need to start reframing the question. And that's where the next point comes in, intervention. What this means is we reframe the question and we ask. And so if you go to the reference desk at a library, you will almost always get this question. Are you looking for this? And then you either say yes or no. And if the answer is no, then we start over again with the step 2 and 3 and 4 until we both agree that, yes, this is the information I'm looking for. And it's at that point, then we offer that information. And then finally, of course, we follow up and give a summary and make sure that they get what they need. Now, you might be wondering, what in the world does this have to do with Wikipedia? And what does this have to do with literacy? What's the connection here? Well, the connection is actually pretty simple. The connection is that when we're talking about literacy, one of the biggest challenges for students or researchers in general is figuring out what information source they actually need. And this is why Wikipedia is so helpful. Because as you pull up an article in Wikipedia, Wikipedia is big enough and broad enough that it helps students narrow in on what they're actually looking for. And if we teach them how to use Wikipedia in this way, we can help them to become, in a sense, their own reference librarian, where they can start to help to figure out for themselves what they're actually looking for. So in a second, as we go through a page, I think this idea will become a lot more clear. The idea here is that in a reference interview, we need to try to figure out what is the exact question that we're looking for. So what we're going to do next is we're going to pull up a page, and we're just going to walk through that page and highlight the information that can be really helpful for students as they're thinking about how to do research and how to get the information they need and to how to develop their own literacy skills when it comes to gaining information that they need for projects or just general information in their life. So what we're going to do is I'm going to open up a Wikipedia. Oh, before I do that, there is an infographic. I think we are going to give you a link for that or a file to download. This is going to just be something that you can have. Hopefully it's something you can even use with students because there's not any technical information on it. It just outlines how a kind of a generic Wikipedia page is laid out. And so we're going to kind of walk through that and show you some of the things to highlight for yourself, but also for your students. And there's a few other examples here as well. We're going to do the Grapes of Wrath one because that's the one our handout looks like. Have I missed anything, Amber? Do you need to jump in for a sec?
Well, let's take a pause. That's a good place for a pause. I did put in the chat, and it looks like Cindy's also got it, a link to this handout. And it's not like your traditional handout. It's more of a picture with some words on it. But it's this idea of being able to walk through some of the features of a Wikipedia article. That is also going to be available with our slides on the Sketch app. So you'll be able to access that when it's comfortable for you. We have a second here. Why don't we pause? Does anybody have any burning questions before we go into the elements of a Wikipedia page? Does anybody have a favorite Wikipedia page? Is there anyone that you just like really like to go to and check out? They're like super excited just to go look at Wikipedia. Well, if you think about it and, oh, Lindsay didn't get through that Wiki Race. Lindsay, this is a great opportunity for you to go back and see, can you get there? And there's actually like a small path and a big path and a medium path. We found a bunch of them, but not them all. But it's kind of a fun thing. Can I get from one topic to another, and how are they connected? Fun things to think about. So we have about 10 minutes left of our day, and I want to be able to look at, does it work to go backwards? Ooh, can you go both directions?
Yes.
So Tim, don't give them away. No spoiler alerts. We want them to have something to go do when they're done with us today. One of the things that we're going to look at is a Wikipedia page today. So this is the same one that's on your handout if you're one of those people that like to follow along. But if you're not familiar with a Wikipedia page, I know that we didn't have anybody that said that they never used it before, but maybe you've not looked at it this critically. So Tim, I'm a student. I don't know anything about Wikipedia. What do I need to do?
Yeah. So after you find your page, and you can search for it up in the search Wikipedia box up here. Can you see my cursor? I'm assuming people can see my cursor. Okay, good. And the first couple paragraphs are probably the most important in terms of what we are looking for in helping our students with literacy and all those different goals, because this will be the high level introduction. So Grapes of Wrath, of course, being a very famous novel, we'll list who wrote it, when it was written, some of the awards that it won, and then we'll give a brief, very brief synopsis of what the novel is about. If in each different kind of article, obviously this is a literary one, but in each article, we're going to get that very high level introduction. One of the things I tell students a lot when I'm working with them is to pay attention to all those links, because each of those links are going to be a possible connection for research, a possible connection for literacy. So for example, you have a student who's interested in Grapes of Wrath, but maybe he's not interested in that particular book, but would find interest in something about John Steinbeck, the author, or the Dust Bowl, or the Great Depression. All of those links will take that student to another option for a research project or idea, or just in general information. Another thing that a lot of students, because of the way in which they use the internet, tend to skim right over and not pay attention to is the table of contents for the article. The contents I always encourage students to think about really carefully, because if they're going to need to write a paper on the Grapes of Wrath, there's their outline right there. They can use that outline as a way to develop their own thinking on it. Now, obviously, we're not going to say just copy it, because that would be plagiarism, but it gives them a way of thinking critically about the subject. So if you were going to write a paper on the Grapes of Wrath, of course, you would probably want to talk about things like plot and characters, and maybe this would be a little bit more in depth, but religious interpretation. You might want to find out what the author had to say about it. And then different adaptations, for example. So maybe a student is not interested in the novel, but is interested in the film or something else. And so each of these content boxes, which are often skipped very quickly, can be a gold mine when it comes to doing research. Now, most articles also have on the other side what I call a context box. I don't know if that's the technical term for it, but it's what gives context to where this particular article sits in the broader encyclopedia of information. And so you can see here, there's a picture of the novel. It tells you who the author is. It will give you some information about that book, when it was published. It actually has things that librarians really care about, like the Dewey Decibel call number for this particular book that no one but me in this room cares about. When we're looking at a country page, so if we're looking up a particular country or a state, the information in this box on the right-hand side will have all kinds of information like population, language, financial information like gross domestic product, ethnicities, languages, government structures, all of those different kinds of things. And so in a really quick glance, it can help a student contextualize the information that they are looking at, which again is one of those skills that they need to develop as we're thinking about literacy. All right, so we're going to actually scroll way down now. We're going to skip all this stuff, which is all really good information. But this is the part of Wikipedia that I think is the gold mine that is most often missed. And somebody already put this in the chat, talking about primary sources and secondary sources. So in every single Wikipedia page, there is going to be something called the references. And in most, but not all of Wikipedia pages, there's going to be what's called a See Also. The See Also is a great tool for our students, because this is that reference question spot. Maybe the student wants to know information about an idea, a topic, but they're not quite there yet. The See Also often will point them to that topic. So in this case, this one doesn't have a lot of examples, but there will often be the suggestions of topics that are similar or connected. In this particular case, there's another novel listed that is often taught at the same time, for example, as the Grapes of Wrath. And then we have the references. One of the rules of Wikipedia is that if at all possible, the references that are used should be electronic resources that are easily accessible. And so here you can see lots of links to different places. And so, for example, even like this one here, number 4, where it has the Pulitzer Prize reference to the novel, for just as an example. And so this is where students can actually get what we might call credible sources. Now we are arguing that Wikipedia in and of itself is credible, but here, if Wikipedia is not allowed by their instructor, these sources, almost all of them, are going to be accepted as credible sources. And then very quickly, we're going to go down, we'll get a bibliography. Now this bibliography, again, is going to be all sources that are considered worthy academic sources. If we're talking in the sort of school framework, these are sources that are valuable for the student. And so again, if Wikipedia is not something that they're going to be allowed to cite in their paper, every one of the sources in this bibliography would be something they could cite. And then finally,
Tim, I'm going to jump in because I wanted to say that as a student, when I was writing my thesis, I would start on a Wikipedia page and use these links and these resources as a starting place for my research. So I actually got a lot of my sources from a Wikipedia page's sources, and it got me in the direction that I needed. And so that idea about how I got this in a more consumable bite then led me to additional information.
Right. And often where these sources will point, and this is true of these external links as well, often where these sources will point is to materials that are in archives at different universities or different museums. You can see here in this particular set, right down here, that actually the whole text of the Grapes of Wrath is available. And so a student who maybe isn't sure how to get a copy of that particular book can click on that link, and they will have the text there for them to look at. And then there's different digital map collections, conversation about John Steinbeck, the author, and what was happening while he was writing that particular book. So these links down here, even if a student is not able to use Wikipedia as a source, points that student to all kinds of information that will be useful for them as they're developing their skills when it comes to being literate, both in terms of maybe doing a research paper, but even more importantly, as they're just trying to develop the skills they need to be literate as they live in the real world.
So Tim, we have 2 minutes left. We have lots we could talk about, but we've got some great questions in the chat, and I don't know if you have the answers or if it's something we're going to have to look up. We have a number of ABE sites that don't have access to the internet, and so are you familiar with if there's a question specifically that says, is there an updated downloadable version?
Yes and no. So Wikipedia can be downloaded. You actually, up at the top, here, let me just do it really quickly. There is a link on the side here where you can download it as a PDF. And so you can download individual articles. You can download the entire thing. It is incredibly huge. So for most students, users, that's going to be, the size is prohibitive. It's just a huge, huge website. But you can download individual articles and save them as PDFs or print them off.
I also had a great thing in the side from our colleague Chris, who said that there's a way to select simple English to help manage some of that, because we have a lot of students with different language acquisition levels. Tim, do you know where that is handy, so you can show us where we can make simple English as our language?
Right down here where there's languages, you can do that. One of the things I encourage a lot of second language students to do is to look up the article. Now, some of the other languages aren't quite as large in terms of the volume of material, but you can often find that article in 2 languages, and they won't be exactly the same article, but often it will be close enough that a student could read that article in their first language. And then as they're looking at the English article, it will help them sort of figure out what's being said, what's being taught. I've had students do that a lot and find that to be really helpful. So they'll have both their first language, the article in their first language and their English article up at the same time. And that will help them navigate some of those challenging words or concepts.
Excellent. It is 3:45. You have had a really long day, my friends. Tim, can you go back to our slides real quick? I just want to kind of leave you with some noodles here. We have some different kinds of pages you can check out. There is your stuff. Go back to Blair for a second. I really want to encourage you on our slides to come back and visit our friend, this link here for Blair Amani. She focuses on Smarter in Seconds. She is a really amazing educator. And she has this video she just posted this week about how to find credible sources. And there's some really interesting thinking points we added to the slide. So if you come back and look at these resources later, I really want to encourage you to think about how could a Wikipedia lesson and this really short bite-sized piece of information come together. Tim, what do we got left before I send them out to have a wonderful rest of their day? So this is Tim and I. Before you leave, I want you to see that this is Tim's very first ABE conference. He's never attended an ABE conference before, and he has attended sessions both of the days, and he keeps telling me all the great things he's learned. So welcome, Tim. We're going to suck you in, and you're going to be an ABE person before you know it. Also, before you leave, please contact us. This is a conversation we would love to keep having. We are available via email anytime. And then for those of you who want something silly to end your day with, Tim and I are trying to garden, and this is our watermelon. We grew that watermelon together and then we ate it, and it was delightful. So thank you so much for joining us. If you have any questions, we can stick around for a few minutes. Otherwise, we want to say thank you for staying with us until the very end of your conference, and please keep in touch. We look forward to working with you as we move forward. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much, friends.